All right, let's go ahead and pray. Lord, we do thank you so much for this time that we can spend together. We thank you for all that you do to facilitate the existence of your people. We thank you for purchasing us with your Son's blood. We thank you for the gift of your Spirit. And we thank you for organizing history and things such that there is a local church, a body that we can belong to. And we do pray that you would use this class hour to strengthen our church in particular and our witness and our witness as a church and our witness as families and individuals to help us to be more faithful with all the time that you would give us until you call us home and until you return. We ask this all in Jesus' name and for his glory. Amen. All right, well, if you're just joining us for the first time or if it's been a while, we're currently doing a trek through world religions. So a broad overview, taking just 1 week per religion, so we're sky level overview, have to be reductionistic. But the point is not just to sate our curiosity or learn some new things for learning new things' sake, just in the abstract. The idea is that this is part of our apologetics track. Probably should have done this the other way, but after our 9 weeks of world religion survey, we'll do an intro to apologetics class where we will consider things like methodology, arguments for the existence of God, general apologetic topics. And then we'll follow that up with a course on the practicalities of having apologetic conversations, engaging non-believing friends and families in conversations that specifically deal with the defense of the faith, which will often be the tenor of an entire conversation or sometimes just pieces of conversations and interactions that you have with your non-believing friends and family. So the purpose of this world religion survey is to give us a little more exposure to the other worldviews and ideas that are out there so that we have at least maybe one or two hooks. So as we have conversations with others that maybe we can either understand a little bit more, like where you're coming from, what is underlying your thinking in this conversation, and what things I might drill into and poke at and pull at in terms of sharing the gospel. What kind of questions do we ask? Where are the key points, the source points, so to speak? And so, in terms of triads, we've covered the three Abrahamic religions, obviously Christianity, but then Judaism and Islam as well. We also looked at slightly different overlapping triad, the three most numerous religions, which are Christianity, Islam, and last week we covered Hinduism. And now we're getting the third of our evangelistic religions. Sociologically, three religions tend to be identified as those are the three evangelistic religions: Christianity, Islam. Does anyone remember what the third one was? What is the third evangelistic religion? Buddhism. That's right. So today we're taking a look at Buddhism. Now, Buddhism arose in the context of Hinduism. Yeah, so depending on your familiarity with either Buddhism or Hinduism, you might have a question at this point. But first, I guess I should ask, does anyone, this one maybe because of various routes into Western culture, this one you might have actually more statistical likelihood to have encountered someone who identifies as a Buddhist or has strong affinities with Buddhism. Maybe like, I like X, Y, and Z about it. Does anyone know anyone? Have you ever had a conversation with someone who identifies as a Buddhist or who's like some nods? Whether it's a full-blown Buddhist or like, yeah, I kind of live the Buddhist lifestyle. This one has a little more inroads into Western, particularly American culture for various reasons, as we'll see in a moment, partly because it's an evangelistic religion. Well, if you're aware of the history and the fact that Buddhism arises in a Hindu context, maybe a question you might have at this point, if you were here with us last week and you remember how big tent Hinduism is. Now, Hinduism is big tent. There is so much what we recognize as contradiction within Hinduism that they're okay with, just due to the nature of the religion, due to the nature of their view of certain metaphysical realities and the ineffability of truth. Hinduism is okay with contradiction. You can be an atheistic Hindu. You can be a monotheistic Hindu. You can be a polytheistic Hindu. So there are all sorts of things that fit under Hinduism. And so you might wonder, well, then why doesn't Buddhism fit? Why does Buddhism get, in one sense, kicked to the curb? It doesn't align. It can't be a branch of Hinduism. We might ask, why isn't Buddhism just a branch of Hinduism? And it is because there are some fundamental rejections from the Buddhist side. Maybe from the Hindu side it could work, but there are some fundamental rejections from the Buddhist side that make Buddhism separate. It moves out, and it's a conscious rejection of Hinduism. In a sense, this is maybe a Hindu and a Buddhist would say this is a very poor analogy, and Muslim too. But Buddhism is kind of like to Hinduism as Islam is to Christianity. It is a heretical offshoot from the perspective of the Hindus, but from the Buddhists, we have captured the actual truth and we're correcting a massive error. So unlike Hinduism, you'll remember, Buddhism has a founder. Hinduism doesn't have a founder. It does have scriptures, but you'll remember the scriptures of Hinduism, the 4 Vedas, and a number of other things are not what we consider scripture. But Buddhism, where it doesn't have scriptures in the same way Hinduism does, it does have a founder who is variously called Siddhartha, spelled various ways, Gautama. Sometimes either of those are given as his surname, first name. Most people understand him and believe him to be a real historical person that existed probably in the 6th, 5th century BC, 520s, 480s, somewhere around there. There's a fellow who, by most accounts, was in upper class in Hindu society. So he's typically said to have come from the warrior class. And you remember in the Hindu caste system, you had a number of classes. Your absolute highest, the priestly caste in the caste system, the priestly caste. You had your nobles, I believe warriors under there, merchants, your bottom of the rung, and then of course the people totally outside the caste system, the Dalits. So he was from a relatively upper caste, from a warrior class, wealthy family by all accounts, and lived a fairly privileged lifestyle, was married, had a child, and he became obsessed, troubled by the troubles of the world. How do I reckon with all the suffering that I see going on? And he wanted to answer that question, and so he leaves his family. By all accounts, they say he had a wife and a young child, and he leaves his wife and his young child to go on a journey to answer this question: how do I wrestle personally with the existence of all this suffering? And is there an answer in general? What do I do about my suffering? What do I do about the world's suffering? And there are lots of different stories involved in his journey and his various visions. But the long story short is he has eventually he gets to a point of meditation where he becomes the enlightened one. He becomes the Buddha, he has an awakening where he realizes the truth. He realizes the truth. Now, Buddhism today, modern Buddhism, roughly divides into 2, 3, depending on who you're asking, branches. And since this is an overview, we can't get into the specifics. I can't often spell the specifics when it comes to Buddhism, but we're going to try to summarize some of the key ideas going back to core heart Buddhism that would, by and large, categorize all the offshoots. And so, Gautama, he becomes the Buddha, the enlightened one, and that involves the apprehension of 4 noble truths. You might have heard that before, the 4 noble truths, the 4th of which is the eightfold, sometimes 10, sometimes other numbers, but the eightfold path. So we'll summarize those today. That's our main goal, is to apprehend the 4-fold truths of Buddhism, the 4 noble truths, the 4th of which is the eightfold path. Therefore, the eightfold path. And then give some hooks about how this fits in to conversations we might have, and how we can address these things and think about them biblically, how we can address them from the point of view of the gospel. So in Buddha's mind, in the Buddha, as in the extant teachings, he offered what kind of is summarized as the middle way. So he's like, we want to avoid extreme asceticism. So Buddha, he rejected the Vedas. He rejected the scriptures of Hinduism, and he rejected the caste system completely. So by and large, the Vedas and the caste system, as big tent as Hinduism is, that's a core. And so this is one of the key reasons why Buddhism can't just be a branch of Hinduism. It totally rejects the Vedas and the caste system. And as far as his approach to life, we're charting a middle way. We're avoiding total extreme asceticism. According to tradition, he tried both extreme asceticism or the indulgence of the upper cases in Hindu society and the ways you might pursue freedom into Brahman, into the not the one true self, as we talked about last week. He's charting a middle way. And so we'll look at that via the Four Noble Truths. The first of which, does anyone know? The common Buddhist refrain. Life is suffering. Life is suffering. And people may quibble with that translation. Suffering, dissatisfaction. The point is not, oh, every moment of your conscious life is miserable. That's not the point. Nor is the point life has suffering in it. Like there are going to be times of suffering and you can't avoid that. That's not the point either. That is a very conscious, right, ontological, life is suffering. Not that you will suffer, well, you will, but that's the very definition. It is all of life. All of life is suffering. Again, sometimes people will quibble with this word, dissatisfaction, tension. All of life involves a constant experience of suffering. You can't escape it. It's definitional. It is definitional to all of your experiences, even the good ones. So again, the point is not you will be consciously miserable at all times. No, like sometimes you're happy. Sometimes you're enjoying things. Like, oh, I had fun with my kids, or I really liked that food I ate, or I had, that was a fun movie. All of that Buddhism, recognizes. Yes, you will have times of happiness. But even in those times of happiness, there is always, always at its essence an undercurrent of suffering. Again, sometimes if you think that word is too strong, you can think of it as dissatisfaction or a brokenness. So you really love that meal, you took one bite too many, so you're slightly full, and yeah, that's not ideal. You play with your kids, and that was fun, but then you're done, or then they tripped and got hurt and they cried. Like, how many times does that happen? When you're out with a kid and you're having a great time, especially a little kid, and you're like, man, this is awesome, and then they trip and they skin their knee and they're crying like, oh man, this it ruins the whole day from the child's perspective. Like now it's like the worst day ever. And we say that's ridiculous though. Like you shouldn't let this ruin the whole day. And then the child, your 6-year-old pouts is like, this is the worst day ever. I hated this day. I get so mad when I've done so many nice things for Shadrach. He's not in the room, so I can say it. For Shadrach, I've done so many nice things for you. And then you're like, this is the worst day ever because like one bad thing happened at the end of the day, and it wasn't even that bad. This is the worst day ever. And Buddha would say, he's a little bit more right than you. There's something to that. There's something to that. Life is suffering. It is definitional. You cannot escape it. And so that was the key realization for Buddha. Like, how do I deal with suffering? Well, first I have to recognize that that's just life. All of life is bound up in this lack. There will always be either a presence of things you don't want or a lack of things you do. So a presence of things you don't want or lack. So in everything, there will always be things you don't want involved and things you do but you don't have. Truth number 2. Suffering, discontentment, that lack, however we translate it, comes from, does anyone know? Yeah, desire, attachment. Suffering comes from desire, right? You want something, you don't have it, you suffer. You want you want to not have something, right? Like in the negative. Like, I don't want to have a broken leg. Then I do have a broken leg, so you suffer. Or, you could say, word that positively. I want to have a whole leg, but I have a broken one, so you suffer. So that's the key realization. The reason why, and you can see the logical connection. Life is bound up by suffering because we have these desires that are constantly unfulfilled. Desires positively for things or desires to avoid things. And in both directions, these are constantly unfulfilled. And then the corollary, the only way to alleviate suffering is to what? Well, no, actually. Although maybe in one sense, but no, not in the Buddhist system. What was the other one I heard? Have no desire, right? Get rid of desire. That's the problem, man. That's your problem. The reason you suffer is you have desire. That's just what life is. So what we have to do, we got to get rid of desire. And so the reason Buddhism is an evangelistic religion is because it has a strong undercurrent of humanitarian compassion as kind of its cultural ethos. Is like, there's a lot of suffering out there, and we don't just want to hold on to this truth for ourselves. We realize these noble truths. We want to go share that. We want to go help people. We want to go alleviate the suffering. Life is suffering. Suffering comes from desire. So the only way to alleviate the suffering is to get rid of desire. Well, how do we do that? That seems pretty tough. All of life is desire. How do we get rid of that? And our answer to that is the fourth truth, which is the eightfold path. So we'll have to erase all this and get that on the board. So that's kind of the fourth noble truth, which is step by step. Life suffering. Suffering comes from desire. The only way to alleviate suffering is we have to get rid of desire. How do we do that? Well, we have to follow the eightfold path. And these are the noble truths that Buddha came to understand, and he was awakened to this truth, and then he wants to go out, and he got a band of male followers, and then the goal was to spread this to other people, to go rescue people in Hindu society from their suffering, and this was the way. Questions up to this point? Comments? Yeah, Lexi. Yes, trying to get other people to believe. Consciously thinking, like, we've got to spread this. We've got to get other people to believe. Yeah, good question. I should have defined that. Others? In the sense of, like, Hinduism is not an evangelistic religion. Like, by and large, Hindus aren't trying to convince other people to become Hindus. Judaism is not an evangelistic religion. Like, Jews consciously believe other people shouldn't become Jews. You don't have to be Jewish to be saved. Sociologically, Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness, we all know better. Those get lumped in Christianity, so they get counted with Christianity. We know better, but yeah, like from a sociological perspective, the big three are called Christianity, Jehovah's Witness, Mormonism get lumped under there. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's why. And then but like in terms of the sociological, like, oh, what are the big religions in the world that are actually trying to get converts? It's Christianity, it's Islam, and it's Buddhism. No, yeah. We might make that case. We might make that case. Other questions? All right. So let's elaborate on this fourth of the noble truths, the eightfold path, just a little bit. Some of these are hard to differentiate. Well, they're not hard to differentiate, but just in their one-word form might be more confusing for us. They all start with, not in English, but you translate it into English. They all start with the word right. So first is the right, what did I put? Thinking, how did I word it? Yeah, the right view. First is the right view. You need to have the right view of reality, which is the Four Noble Truths, basically. This is, when he says right view, he's talking about you need to have apprehended and understood life is suffering. Suffering comes from desire. The only way to get rid of suffering is to get rid of desire. So you have to have apprehended that. You have to have apprehended the first three noble truths before you can start. So the first part of the noble path is you have the right view. Then there is, again, some of them overlap, right thinking, but right desire. You have to have the right desire. And so all of this, this isn't a step-by-step process in the sense of like I do step one first, then I do step two. Sometimes there's a kind of logical relationship to some of them where it's like, oh yeah, this one kind of comes first, but they're all an ever-continuing process. You're always wanting to grow, and you'll see as we get to like number 8, some of those are designed, the later ones are designed to help you solidify the earlier ones. You want to have the right view, you have to understand life is suffering. You want to have the right desire. The right desire in this sense being, again, more narrow, being you have to desire to follow this path. You have to desire to get rid of suffering. You have to consciously desire that. You have to consciously desire to get rid of. It presents a contradiction. Now, what is the other word? Is resolve. I use desire. Well, actually, let's put resolve first. The right resolve. I'll put desire. You have to have the right resolve. You have to resolve to get rid of your suffering. You have to resolve to consciously want that. So you've understood life is suffering. You understood suffering comes from that. You have to consciously resolve, I'm going to address that now. The reason why I use the word desire here is because of one of those little, I think, metaphysical problems that exists in Buddhism. I don't know how coherent it is to say. You'll talk to Buddhists who recognize this problem and they talk about it. And so you can ask a Buddhist more, you meet a Buddhist, you can ask him more. But this is one of those hooks where maybe I would go, which is all suffering comes from desire. You got to get rid of desires. So how does it work to get rid of desire? Like you have to have desire to get rid of desires, right? So you see, that's where we start to run into potentially a metaphysical, logical contradiction. Okay, we could call it resolve, but it's a desire. I have to want this. I have to want this. But isn't wanting your problem? How can you want to be rid of wants? There's a hang up there. So you got to have this right resolve. You got to want to follow the Eightfold Path. You got to want to get rid of your suffering. The next ones, I don't know that the order matters, but I'll give you the order they're usually given in, the traditional order. Right speech. Things including don't lie, don't spread malicious gossip. So some of the stuff will be more concretely recognized by us as don't sin with your mouth. Right? Don't sin with your mouth. Don't tear people down. Don't curse. That sort of thing. And number 4, corollary, right action. So again, this would overlap a lot with what we understand to be sins of commission in terms of actual acting out. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't beat up people. Many of them things that would be listed under Buddhism, right speech, right action, by and large, we go, yeah, those are right speech. That is right action. Now, we're going to get to the metaphysical problem in a moment, but the big question we always have, kind of that presuppositional question from the outside is, well, what is right speech? How do you know this? How do you know these categories of things are right speech and these categories are right action? It seems you kind of just assume no lying, no cursing, no murdering, no adultery. It's things we agree with. But how do you know? Like, where does this category come from? Especially given your metaphysics, which we'll get to in just a moment. I want to get all 8 of the path on the board. The next one is right livelihood, and for classical kind of original Buddhism, there's only one option, which is, what do you have to do with your life? Huh? There's only one. There's only one thing you're technically allowed to do. They have expanded this, huh? Yeah, you got to be a monk. That is the only way. This has been expanded. Like, now it's not the only way. Now there's, you know, I'm being reductionistic for effect. There is an understanding that, yeah, there is a way to be a non-monk Buddhist. There are systems that in place, but in kind of the core essence of Buddhist thought, monk is the highest thing you could do. So even though there are ways to be a Buddhist and not be a monk, that's still the ideal. You remember when we did our survey of church history, and at least in the beginning with a lot of the monastic orders in early church, the understanding was not this was like the only way to be a Christian, or this was the ideal Christian life. Or sometimes it was very consciously viewed as a temporary thing, kind of like a seminary thing. This was a way of discipleship, but this was not like, oh, this is what it looks like to be a Christian. That was not the understanding of monasticism necessarily in all the different branches. Some yes, some no. Whereas in Buddhism, no, it is very consciously like this is the highest ideal, right? Like if you are not a monk, you are a step down. You could be doing better. You could be doing better. Now, of course, particularly in a pluralistic society, in the modern world, not many Buddhists will probably talk like that, but it's kind of inherent to the theology, we'll call it, the worldview. So you got to be a monk, and there's all sorts of specifics of what it looks like to be a Buddhist monk. Some similarities, certain types of asceticism as we might think of like with Christian monastic movement, but lots of also specifics that we won't get into here. So you got to have the right livelihood. You got to be a monk. You also have to have the right effort, exertion. You have to have the right effort. You have to put the right effort in, and we can kind of. So in Buddhism, you have unwholesome states, unwholesome, and wholesome. And this refers to various things, whether it's state of minds, often state of minds, but it could be other things too, situations. So there's the unwholesome and there's the wholesome. And you can either be in an unwholesome state or you can be in a wholesome state. And it's not like it's one or the other. You could be in a wholesome state regarding one thing and an unwholesome state regarding another. Like they recognize, it's not all or nothing. Like I could be in a wholesome state relative to my relationship with my son and an unwholesome state relative to my relationship to work. So it's not all or nothing. So there's various states you can be in. Wholesome, unwholesome, and so obviously with the unwholesome, you want to avoid, but if you're in them, you want to get out, right? You want to abandon. And for the wholesome states, you want to pursue, and if you're in them, you want to maintain. And so the sixth path kind of deals with this sort of grid. I forget the Buddhist term for it, but the sixth path kind of deals with this grid where you have to be consciously understanding and making the effort either to maintain the wholesome states you're in or to abandon the unwholesome states, to avoid unwholesome states you're not in, to pursue wholesome states that you're not in. So you've got to be putting in an effort. There is a conscious effort that has to go. So you have to understand these states. You have to understand what counts as wholesome, not wholesome, and then you have to make an active effort to pursue, avoid, abandon, maintain, so on and so forth. 7 is right. This is some of the overlap in terminology. Right mindfulness. And this is distinct from right view. Like by and large, if we're talking about the right view in the Buddhist, the first path of the Eightfold Path, the right view is you understand the Four Noble Truths. You believe that about the world. You believe that about the world, and you believe you have to follow this path. When it comes to right mindfulness, we're dealing more with an understanding of your own mind. Like you understand your mind is going to play tricks on you. You understand your mind is going to lie to you. You understand your mind is going to be an enemy in one sense to following these 8 paths. And so you have to be vigilant against your own mind. You have to be conscious that like my mind is not going to get things right all the time. So I have to be aware of my own thinking. That's kind of what they're getting at with right mindfulness. Right mindfulness is I have to be aware I'm not always going to be having or thinking the right view, and I need to be aware of that. I need to be really self-aware, and to be able to diagnose myself and to address myself. Yeah, Tim. I'm going to get to that in a second. Yeah, yeah. You said non-theistic, right? No, no, yeah. I'm going to get to that in just a second. That's huge. I wanted to get all these on the board before we get to those kind of big questions, which are questions. And then lastly, we have our right, they say concentration, but or at least a lot of lists will say concentration, but how do you distinguish that between mindfulness? What they mean here is meditation. The right practices, by and large, you can kind of summarize practices. Like, what does it mean, right meditation? It doesn't mean thinking about the right things. It means like the actual practices. And there are various Buddhist practices of meditation. It means engaging in the right types of meditation and doing them, and that will help you, right? So you see some of them very lot. That will help you have the right mindfulness, which will help you maintain the right view at all times, so that you can then have the right resolve, and then you can do the right speeches and the right actions. And all of this, the goal, right? So we haven't really talked about the metaphysics yet. What's the goal? Well, the goal is to get rid of suffering. But what does that mean? What does it mean? Does it mean to achieve a life of like where you're not suffering at all? Because if you're always kind of you're in this system, and you know you're not always going to be in the always in wholesome states. Sometimes you'll be in unwholesome states. You know you don't always have the right view. Like, is it just an ever like, oh, we want to eliminate as much suffering as possible? No, like in the Buddhist metaphysic, there is an end goal. So questions here before I erase this and move on. Glaring things. Yeah, Paul. So yeah, to a certain extent, I want to hold my tongue, but to the amount that I know, I don't want to overspeak, but relatively a lot. Like, yeah, yeah, relatively a lot. I mean, Buddhism has made much more inroads into Western world because of its evangelistic nature. Where I said I kind of talked at the beginning. If you came in later, there, you do have a sort of soft Buddhist light where like you haven't adopted all the metaphysics, but you have adopted a lot of the practices. Where you have people who either don't identify as Buddhists or they identify as Buddhists and they don't adopt any of the metaphysics, but they kind of have appropriated a lot of the practices, and that has happened in Western society a lot. So you meet people who maybe even don't identify as Buddhists, but they consciously use Buddhist practices. I know someone like this. Like, he wouldn't call himself a Buddhist, but he practices Buddhism, and he would say like he doesn't believe any of the metaphysical claims as we're about to get to, but he thinks like, yeah, the system Buddhism has come up with is pretty darn good for life. For yeah, the meditation, the mindfulness, this kind of grid of wholesome, unwholesome, and various lingo that appears. So I don't want to overstate and say like, oh, every time you hear someone talk about mindfulness, there's an undercurrent of Buddhism, but maybe more than you would necessarily have known before or guessed. It has made a lot of inroads into Western thinking. Good question. Other questions? Yes, Lexi. Originally, no. Originally, it was only a male thing. So I don't quite know how that was handled from the metaphysical theologically, but originally, no. Now they tend to have similar to kind of Christianity, at least in some Buddhist circles, you can have separate orders. And I don't know how all the specifics work, but originally, no. Now, yes. Good question. Other questions? All right. So, but what about the metaphysics? What about the theology? The theology of Buddhism. How do we think about this? Well, they rejected the case system. They rejected the case system, but they did not reject reincarnation and they rejected the Brahman, the ultimate self. So in Buddhist, you remember in Hindu thinking, uh, illusion played a big part, right? Everything is illusion. There is one self, and you are that self. Not not you're part of that self. You are that self, and all this individuality is an illusion. It's not real. And in the and but how, what can you say about that self? Nothing. You remember that you can't. It's totally ineffable. No words. You can't say anything about that ultimate reality. And we looked at the problem with that. No, we believe ultimate reality is verbal. You can say things about it. Yeah, you can't exhaustively capture ultimate reality, but God is a speaking God, and He's always been a speaking God. In the beginning was the Word. Before there was any speech, before there was any language, there was a word. So we recognize, yes, you can say things. And so in Hinduism, you have the ineffable ultimate reality that you can't say anything about, and even the fact that you say you can't say anything about is saying something about it, and that's weird. But in Buddhism, they kind of rejected this ultimate self. Buddhism, self is an illusion. One of the illustrations in Buddhist literature is like a chariot. You've got a chariot. Chariot is an illusion. There's no such thing as a chariot. There's a wheel. There's this thing that but the chariot as the concept, as like the unified whole, like that doesn't exist. They would say there's just a bunch of pieces. And so when you talk about the self is kind of like that. There is not a real thing, the self. There's just a composite of pieces. And they break those down a little bit more. But so they do believe in reincarnation. But sometimes when we think of reincarnation, all right, so we do our vessel, our life one, and then you've got, a new vessel, life two. Maybe this was I don't know, a priest. He was a really bad priest, and then his next life he's a butterfly. Significant downgrade. Significant downgrade. And at least I would guess that the majority of people who don't believe in reincarnation, who've only heard of it from a popular level, kind of think of it this way. It's like, and this is more true of Hindu thinking. But so you've got your vessel, your body, your brain, everything. But inside is the soul, right? Ooh, there's the soul. And so the soul is there in the life, and the soul is eternal, and then the soul goes here, So that's reincarnation. The soul moves on and starts a new life, and it's this eternal cycle, right? And you're trying to escape it. You're trying to escape it in Hinduism. Same thing in Buddhism. You are trying to escape the cycle, but for Buddhism, it's not because you're trying to escape individuality, right? That's in Hinduism. Individuality is an illusion. You're trying to escape these illusions. You're trying to get free of all these illusions. And merge, again, is not the right word, because you are the one self. There's nothing to merge back into. You are it. But it's to escape that illusion of not recognizing that you're it. So in Hinduism, you have this system of reincarnation, and the goal is to escape it. And in Buddhism, the goal is to escape it, but in the sense of, because it's suffering. It's a system of suffering, and you want to get out of the suffering. You want to get out of the suffering. You want to get to the point of non-suffering. The sense of non-being, the nirvana. And what does Buddhism say about that? Relatively little, just that it's the state of non-suffering. I think originally nirvana is like, what does this word come from? It's like it's what's left when you blow out a candle. That's nirvana. It's gone. But so we tend to think of it this way, I would guess. And this is closer to Hinduism. You've got a soul, and it is preserved, and it goes on to the next life. In Buddhism, this is no. This is not correct at all. Buddhism is very non-committal, like consciously non-committal, meaning like committed towards their non-committal on what is preserved in reincarnation. Buddhism, and in much of Buddhist thought, they are very consciously against this idea that there is a soul. They're against very much the idea that there is this independent self, that there's a soul. The question of whether the soul is separate than the body, there exists a soul and a body, that's considered one of the unanswerable questions in Buddhism. I'll talk about that in just a moment. It's considered one of the unanswerable questions. For Buddhism, it's closer to recycling, reincarnation. You ask, like, you guys, you recycle stuff, right? Some of you. You recycle. Does anyone here, if you do, you're the exception. So I'm not really talking to you. Does anyone here know what happens when it goes, like what do they do, how much of it is saved, how does it end up into being that's reincarnation in Buddhism. It's like recycling. Something is preserved. I don't know what. You don't know what. It's not a thing that's in another thing like a soul from your body. We don't know that. We don't know the relationship between the soul and the body. Something is preserved. Something is reincarnated. It's not a self. We can't be that specific. So it's more like recycling. You recycle a plastic bottle, and eventually you get a plastic, I don't know, keychain, and there's some relationship between them, but you and I don't know it. That's more like the Buddhist idea of reincarnation. But the goal is to get out of suffering. And this is the thing, right? So this, I mentioned the unanswerable questions. There's various lists, 10 unanswerable questions, 14 unanswerable questions. But there are a lot of unanswerable questions in Buddhism. And you are not supposed to waste your time on them. Like whether or not God exists, whether or not there is time, whether or not the universe was eternal, whether or not space is infinite or limited, whether or not your soul exists independent from your body, whether or not there's conscious experience of life after death. Those are all unanswerable questions. If Buddha, in the tradition, if Buddha's asked this, he's always silent. He doesn't care to answer these questions. And in fact, he gives parables against answering these questions. The most famous is the poisoned arrows. Anyone ever heard this parable? This Buddhist parable? And so this is like in the telling, at least in one of the common tellings, one of Buddha's disciples says, like, you've got to answer these unanswerable questions. If you don't answer these questions, I'm out of here. I'm not going to be your disciple anymore. And Buddha says, and he gives him this parable. He's like, you're like a person who's shot by a poison arrow. You're shot by a poison arrow, and they rush you to the surgeon, and you're like, wait, before you pull out this poison arrow, I need to know who shot it, and his ethnicity, and what his parents' names were, and what the wood is made out of, and where and who he bought the wood from, and that merchant. He's like, all these questions are immaterial. He's like, they're irrelevant, and you're going to die while you're asking them. You got to get the arrow out. And he says, all these questions are irrelevant. We're all suffering, and we got to get out of the suffering. So let's address the suffering. None of these questions are going to help you address the suffering. And so Buddhism, in kind of its like classic purity, tends to be, so I say this with a very big asterisk, it tends to be anti-metaphysical in one sense, but if you look at certain sects of Buddhism, it has a very, very detailed metaphysical schemes, cosmology, very, very detailed. I couldn't even hope to reproduce some of the charts on the board. Very, very detailed cosmology, metaphysics, but in a certain sense, those are ancillary. Those are ultimately unimportant because if they're proven wrong, it's not a big deal because the goal is to get rid of suffering. So you can't ask all those questions. They're not helpful. Just like you got the poison arrow in your side, you don't need to know who shot the arrow. You don't need to know, what kind of wood it's made out of. You just need to remove the arrow. You don't need to know if there's a God. You don't need to know if there's life after death. You don't need to know, if the universe is eternal, whatever. You just need to end your suffering. And the problem, at least one of the big problems I see, is, let's use the parable. If I got shot with the poison arrow, I do kind of want to know who shot it. And whether or not they're going to shoot me again. And where are they? So there are some questions that are kind of relevant. Like, where are they? That's an important question, And maybe that question does come first before I pull it out. Yes, I do. Yeah, surgery is a priority. I want to address this. But before I can address this, I've got to take cover. Or if I'm not, in battle and I'm here, like say I'm at church, and so, I want to know which one of you shot me, so I know how to relate to you in the future. I don't just want to pull this out and then come back to Sunday school next week. Well, one of those people in this room shot me with an arrow. That's kind of an important question relative to that arrow. And so you have these whether you want to call them contradictions or really important metaphysical points. Buddhism says you don't need to worry about those because you're all suffering. Let's address suffering. How do you know this is going to address suffering? How do you know any of this is going to address suffering if we don't know why we suffer? If we don't know where suffering came from? If we have a wrong view of suffering? If we have a wrong view of the world? I mean, I don't understand how it is coherent to say it does not matter whether a God exists or not. You're suffering, let's deal with that. I don't understand how that's coherent. Because doesn't it matter? If God does exist, doesn't that matter to that equation? I mean, there's some some significant problems with the Buddhist way of thinking. So, for instance, we take life is suffering, and we're trying to get rid of it all. Was Martin Luther a Buddhist? That goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. Martin Luther a Buddhist? His Buddhist? What did he mean when he said that? What did Martin Luther mean? He didn't mean Buddhism. What did Martin Luther mean? Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also, the mighty fortress. Let all this go. Be free. What did he mean? Julian. Yes, not to let those things hinder your pursuit of Christ. So you are pursuing something, right? Again, I mentioned, I think it's kind of incoherent to say you need to pursue not pursuing things. Like that, I don't know how that works. But we recognize, no, you do pursue something. There is intent. There is purpose. Just like last week relative to Hinduism. No, you can say things, and you can say true things, because word, in one sense, is prior to creation. There was always God, and God was always a speaking God. He's a Trinitarian God. He has always been speaking. There's always been message. There's always been messenger, even before there were any people, or trees, or air, or anything like that. In kind of a parallel fashion, relative to Buddhism, no, there is purpose. There is purpose. There is intent. There is a creator. We recognize, yes, there is personal intent to the universe. And so there is pursuit. There's pursuit of things. Buddhism says life is suffering, and it says it's all suffering. We recognize, like, yeah, there is lots of suffering, isn't there? There's lots of suffering. But how do we say that in the Christian way? Give me the Christian theological diagnosis of the world, of life. Lexi. Yeah, there's brokenness and sin. Why? Because ultimately it is a fallen world. This is a fallen world. Sin, there is a problem. There is a specific problem. There's a sin. How can you address the suffering? Is just a symptom, right? You can't just address the symptoms. You have to address the underlying cause. Buddhism says the underlying cause doesn't matter. They say, no, reality matters. What's true matters. Why is there suffering in life? And we also don't agree, because Buddhism says it's all suffering. There's actually nothing ultimately good about this life. Your goal is to escape. That's the goal. That's the goal of you ultimately become enlightened, and you get to be out of the sequence of reincarnation. You get to be the extinguished candle. You get to what is that existence like? Buddhism doesn't care, but you get to enter nothingness, something, whatever. You're just free from life. What does that get wrong? What does it get wrong to say life is suffering? Think Genesis. God said it's very good. God made this world good. So you have to understand the world aright. If something is good, so again, these questions matter. Like even just from a hypothetical, you're talking to a non-believer, you're talking to an atheist. Doesn't it matter whether or not this world is created good by a good God or not relative to your suffering and how you're going to address it and how you're going to think? Don't those questions matter? Buddhist says, no, it doesn't matter. You're just suffering. Let's deal with the suffering. No, those questions matter. Is this world good or not? That's going to affect, right? Just like so you could say it like this way, very simplistic. I eat something and it upsets my stomach. It matters whether or not what I ate was poison or whether it was expired, doesn't it? Because if it was poison, I'm not going to eat it again. If it was expired, well, I might eat it again. But if I interpret it as poison and I don't eat it again, well, then I'm missing out on something that I'm designed to have and I'm designed to enjoy. So Buddhism wants to address, we can say, a symptom, but kind of thinks the underlying cause is not important. We recognize as Christians, no, ultimate reality matters for how you think about all the attendant small things, right? It's not, we say, right? We say it all the time in this church and in all good churches everywhere. Church and your faith is not a Sunday thing. This is an all of life thing, because the ultimate realities matter for when you do laundry, when you brush your teeth, for all of these things. All right, any final questions or comments? Alexi. That's okay. Not to my knowledge, apart from the ultimate ideal of it's ideal to be a monk and live the monastic lifestyle. But I might be wrong, or certain sects might have different things. But to my knowledge, Buddhism doesn't like encourage. It's a very individual. You do it. You don't need other people. But part of helping with the mindfulness, part of helping, you get others to help you through, meditation, so that you have the right mindfulness, so you can maintain the right view. So it is part of, like, they're very pragmatic in that sense, recognizing, like, yeah, I need help to do this, but I don't know if there's anything inherent. Like, if you didn't need help, like, oh man, I'm great. Okay, well then fine, you're great. You don't need to come. But again, put an asterisk there because I don't know all the different sects or what they would say. But to my knowledge, there's not an inherent, you need to congregate to be a Buddhist. Good question. Any others? All right, let's close with prayer. Lord, again, we do ask that you would just help us, that this would not just be an information hour, but that this would be equipping to us, that even if we don't remember many of the specifics, we will be further convinced of your truth and the importance of ultimate reality, and understanding that, understanding you, understanding Father, Son, Holy Spirit, understanding the nature of the world that you created, the nature of the problem and our sin, and the solution in Christ and his cross, the hope of resurrection. Make these things real and concrete to us, so that when we hear worldviews and ideas that go utterly astray, we're able to speak the gospel to them. We pray all this in Jesus' name for his glory. Amen. All right, you have 9 minutes, 9.5, 9 minutes until service starts.